Disaster in the Chinese Grand Prix for Ferrari, a double disqualification, a team orders radio controversy, and now a massive championship gap to the dominant McLarens out front. Scott, I think we should start with probably the biggest of the disasters, this double disqualification. Both Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton thrown out of the race for technical infringements. What happened? What went wrong?
Yeah, it's not even adding insult to injury. It's both the insult and the injury combined into one. It was already a fairly mediocre day. Ferrari tried to put a little bit of gloss on it by pointing out that the points haul they got in the sprint, and obviously this weekend started with Lewis Hamilton's first win for Ferrari, and it won't be remembered as such in the next few days. As they pointed out, they had the second highest points haul of any team from this weekend, but fifth and sixth wasn't much to write home about. But they don't even go away clinging on to that silver lining, the double whammy of both cars getting disqualified, and it's such a rarity. It's actually rare for a single car to get disqualified. It does happen sort of once or twice a season, but very much an uncommon occurrence for both cars from the same team to get done for separate offences as well. That is real uncharted territory in the modern era. So for Leclerc, the very simple, straightforward transgression of being 1 kilogram under the weight limit. And no, that wasn't because of the front wing damage picked up on the first lap, because you replace the front wing when you do the weigh-in. You're allowed to address that and basically have a substitute part in place, but it still came in a kilo under the weight limit. And then on Lewis Hamilton's side, even finer margins, plank wear that went beyond the permitted amount, 0.5 millimetre and 0.4 of a millimetre on either side, basically, where the planks get measured. So really, really fine margins, probably not to the point where it was massively performance enhancing or performance enhancing at all. Certainly the end result for Ferrari wouldn't suggest that they got a huge benefit out of it, but incredibly, incredibly costly misjudgments.
Yeah, these kind of things are bang to rights usually, aren't they? It's a hard line set by the FAA. I know nominally you're allowed to appeal decisions and exclusions within a certain time limit, but if they get you on measurements, usually you don't see a kind of right or review launched or somebody appealing this, right?
No, and you've seen it with Ferrari and also Alpine. Pierre Gasly got done for being under the weight limit as well. Everyone's basically held their hands up and said, yep, your measurements are correct. The way you've done it's correct. This was an error on our part, and they've basically accepted it. I don't think they'd get anything out of it if they did try, but Ferrari's not even going to attempt to, which I think shows it's an immediate holding of the hands up and saying, we got this badly wrong. And I think they'll be quite embarrassed by it, to be honest, because one technical infringement along these lines is bad enough. Two is particularly problematic. It's not befitting of a team that is aiming to fight for the championship. You need to be better than this.
Yeah, mistakes happen, obviously, but, with these kind of things, you might look at it and go, well, it's just, like you say, 0.5 millimetre, it's just 1 kilo, but that's enough. There's no kind of allowances made for finger trouble or mistakes of this magnitude. I guess there'll be a proper review and internal investigation by Ferrari down the line into what went wrong. It's unfortunate that we heard from team boss Fred Vasseur before all of this happened, so we don't have his reaction or at least initial explanation. But I imagine he'd probably just defer and say, well, we need to look into it, etc.
Well, he doesn't. Fred doesn't like to give much away at the best of times. But I do wonder on that score, because he'd gone into the China weekend dismissing a rumour from Melbourne that one of the reasons the Ferrari pace fell away as the weekend continued in Australia was that they'd had to raise the car's ride height a little bit because the car was running too low and it was wearing the floor, the plank of the floor too much in Melbourne. If you remember there, Leclerc had been quickest in Friday practice, but then they were nowhere in qualifying and struggled in the race as well. And the problems were consistent with having to raise the car up and not run it in the optimum window for how the floor works and produces the downforce. And Ferrari, and actually, ironically, Leclerc and Hamilton had a double disqualification for plank wear back in Austin in 2023, I think it was.
That's right.
They've fallen foul of this before in terms of running the car too low and wearing the plank. If you're going to add 2 and 2 together, you would say that they've done this in Melbourne, allegedly, and now this has happened in China, and actually the wear is too severe. Maybe that's a bit of a hint of where Ferrari's running the car and what they're trying to do to get the performance out of it. But just to come back to that Fred point, he'd already gone into the weekend dismissing one thing, so I suspect he wouldn't have been too forthcoming after the race either.
No, it's interesting about the setup situation, because Leclerc himself in his Thursday briefing, I think it was, before China, sort of hinted that they'd had to make this change, this kind of change, at Melbourne to make sure the car was legal. So there was a little bit of inconsistency maybe between what the driver was saying, what the team boss was saying. We know how sensitive the cars are to ride height, and the lower you can go, in theory, the more performance there is. I thought it was quite interesting that Haas, which uses obviously the Ferrari wind tunnel in Maranello, they definitely ran into a ride height problem in Melbourne. They were having to come up quite significantly and shed the performance. In China, obviously, they were transformed. They looked like the sort of credible midfield team you'd expect. And obviously, Shanghai resurfaced, new track surface. Everyone was saying it was grippier, smoother than it used to be. So it does kind of make sense that if you're a bit margin on the ride height and you need to go lower than you've been able to go so far, that you would stray into that territory. So maybe it's just one of those marginal calls where Haas got it right and Ferrari got it wrong.
And we also did see a better version of Ferrari in Shanghai as well, which would kind of support that argument that the car was in a better place, and therefore that came from running it the way that they want to setup-wise. And when you pile all of those factors together, you do get the impression that the car was running low and perhaps a bit too low. You had Hamilton in not only on pole and then obviously winning the sprint, but also the race pace that the Ferraris had in the sprint. Both Hamilton and Leclerc towards the end of that sprint was really strong. And I think what's happened is they've made some setup choices for main qualifying in the race, because Parc Fermé opened up again after the sprint, and they've not necessarily taken it too far in terms of how low they've run the car, but they've made other changes and it's just taken it out of that window. But by and large, it was a much better weekend overall for Ferrari in terms of the absolute potential of the car, and maybe the height that they were running it played into that. Obviously, the potential was so great that Leclerc thought, this was long before he'd been disqualified, but Leclerc thought he would have been in victory contention had he not damaged his front wing on the first lap, hitting Hamilton.
Well, that's one change that certainly Ferrari didn't make deliberately. Leclerc just accidentally tagging Hamilton, a bit like he did in Melbourne, actually, when they were racing each other towards the end. But on this front wing thing, what the hell was going on with that car that Leclerc could knock the end plate off and then be quicker than Lewis Hamilton, who won the sprint the day before?
Yeah, I'm wondering if the clue there is that whatever changes they made to the car and how they'd set it up, given Hamilton's struggles in the Grand Prix compared to how strong he was in the sprint, the car was moving around a lot. It seemed a little bit like maybe to protect the front axle, they'd made the car a little bit more on the nose and a bit looser at the rear, but then Hamilton was struggling with kind of all four wheels sliding and just not really having grip front and back. And that's why, we'll get onto it in a minute, but Hamilton thought it was better off Leclerc going ahead of him because he could feel that he was holding his teammate up, even though Leclerc had the damaged front wing. So I wonder if there's a possibility here with the way that Ferrari had sort of suboptimally set the car up for the race. I'm wondering if, almost by accident, Leclerc's front wing damage actually balanced it back out again a little bit, because Leclerc's car actually looked really, really strong. If you watch the onboards, because I was following both of their races very closely through the first stint and the second stint, when Leclerc was chasing Hamilton, you would not have thought that Leclerc was the car with the broken front wing. The body language of Hamilton's car was way more consistent with the broken front wing, and Leclerc was compensating for it as well, obviously with some brilliant driving of his own and different lines. He was absolutely monstering some of the curbs through the turn 1, 2 and 3 complex and that other complex that leads onto the back straight, for example. I do wonder if the way the race played out, obviously Leclerc was victim to Max Verstappen at the end, and Hamilton on the two-stop very nearly caught and passed Leclerc back up. I wondered if maybe the way that Leclerc was driving to compensate for the front wing problem actually meant that he was ultimately taking more out of the tyre, and it was kind of like a short-term gain in the first stint and the second stint that was going to bite him at the end. But there's definitely something amiss there, because I don't think, regardless of how it compared to Hamilton, I don't think Leclerc in that Ferrari should have been that fast with that much damage on the front wing. So I think that might speak to something about where they got the balance wrong on the car for the Grand Prix.
Yeah, it's difficult to unpick, isn't it, when the cars are so heavy with fuel at the start of the race, so much lighter at the end, the track rubbers in, the compounds change. It was quite clear that Leclerc couldn't sustain that pace all the way through the race. By the end, as you mentioned, he was really struggling and fell victim to Verstappen and also Hamilton as well. There was even a suggestion they could swap the places back. He was falling away, but that didn't happen. On the place swap, this created a huge, what Fred Vasseur would call a mess behind the scenes, because from the broadcast, it very much looked like a case of Ferrari kind of instructing Hamilton to let Leclerc pass because he was too slow, and Hamilton not really complying with that instruction in very quick order. But it seems the reality, it's certainly as far as Ferrari is concerned, is quite different.
Yeah, so Vasseur said it was a joke the way that that whole situation got portrayed, and actually the vast majority of messages were relayed honestly and authentically within the sort of the usual kind of time delay, which can still muddy the waters slightly, because if a radio message has long since been delivered, but you see it on screen at a certain time, or hear it being played with certain images, it can create a different picture. All of that aside, most of it was fine. The key thing was, and this is what really annoyed Vasseur, they missed the very first message that kicked it all off, which, as I mentioned earlier, was Hamilton saying that he should let Leclerc go because he was going too slow. And as soon as you know that, the whole context of everything changes. And
so it was a driver-led thing then? It was the driver saying, basically, let's do this, rather than the usual story of the team kind of telling a reluctant driver to comply.
Yeah, exactly. Hamilton realised he was struggling and knew that Leclerc was close behind, so suggested that they swap positions. The key thing was that once Ferrari then tried to impose that team order, they were kind of doing it in a way that Hamilton didn't quite agree with because of where they were trying to get him to do the swap and when they were trying to get him to do the swap. So again, it's all about context and perspective. When you know that Hamilton was willing to do the swap and actually suggested it, everything that happens afterwards you have to view with a sense of he will comply. He will do this eventually. It's just about doing it in the right way, rather than him being difficult. So he was just adjusting to the way that specific circumstances were playing out. For example, the first call that he got to change position, he was actually chasing and about to pass Lance Stroll's Aston Martin into the corner where Ferrari had told him to move aside. So he's not going to move aside there. Then the next time that he gets the order, actually Leclerc's just out of DRS range and then just getting back inside DRS range. So actually there's a full second between them. It's not like Leclerc's on his gearbox. The next time by, because of George Russell losing some time to Alex Albon's Williams up ahead, Hamilton's realised that the gap to the car in front's now half the size that it was a couple of laps ago. So now Hamilton's saying, well, let me just see if I can catch these. I think I'm getting closer, so let's just wait. All of that stuff happened without actually any kind of drama. There wasn't any major stress. And then finally, when Hamilton decided this was the moment to do it, that came off the back of Ferrari saying, right, we want it now into turn 14. And again, Hamilton was saying, I'll tell you when. But the emphasis was on the when, rather than, look, I'll make this decision if we're going to do this. It was very much a matter of when, because he did it 2 corners later. He didn't want to just slow down on the back straight, lose a load of time. He decided to let Leclerc catch up a little bit more through 2 more corners, and then he rolled it through turn 1 and let Leclerc pass on the inside. So it was actually, there was very little drama about it in reality. It was all because of one would kind of have to agree with Vasseur, deliberately omitted radio message, because they managed to catch every other one except for the one that turned the whole thing into nothing.
It's very unfortunate, I think, for Ferrari that the Lewis-Hamilton radio communication thing is such an element of focus, particularly for the broadcast. Obviously, you had the back and forth between him and Riccardo Adami in Australia. You know, as they try to figure each other out, there's extra communication, as you'd expect. It's not as efficient, and you've got this back and forth. What sounds like disagreement, that gets blown up into a story. I think Vasseur was quite annoyed about that in the first instance. And then you have this other thing piled on top, and I think it's the first time he's getting close this season to losing his cool. Is there anything he can do about it? He sort of seemed to mention that he might take the issue up with FOM. So what are the next steps?
Yeah, I think he's definitely going to try and have a conversation. If he wants to do something directly, it will probably be to F1 CEO Stefano Domenicali, or he can instruct other members of his team to speak to their counterparts, like on the communication side, for example. I think this is more a case of Vasseur being very good at protecting his team and protecting his own, looking after them, flipping it so that the scrutiny is now on F1 for doing it rather than what was said. And he knows that he's in a strong place to do it, because, as I was explaining before, that it was pretty much a non-issue and they've turned it into one. So he's in a good place there. I think the bigger picture here for Vasseur is he's got to try and get things a bit more, not under control, because he was annoyed that there was this suggestion that everything was a mess after Australia. But there's too many things going wrong for Ferrari at the moment, whether it's not getting the car in the right window, whether it's making fundamental errors that lead to technical infringements and disqualifications like this. Suboptimal communication, which was the case in Australia, and maybe could have been a bit sharper in this race here. These are all things that are within Ferrari's control. And I think Vasseur's probably better off focusing on that. I understand he's asked a question, he's answered honestly, so it's not like he's going out of his way to moan about it, but he will consider this to all be noise and a distraction. His priority has to be getting Ferrari to get the most out of its weekends, because they're letting too much slip at the moment, and they've got bigger problems to worry about.
Yeah, you're right. They have got bigger problems. Sprint win aside, it's been a very difficult start to the season for Ferrari. They're way behind in the Constructors' Championship. Not as far as they were after Singapore last year, and they obviously made a fight of that with McLaren. But it's given how quick the McLaren's been in the early races, you can't afford to be shipping points like they have done in China. There's a lot of work ahead for Ferrari if they want to get back in this fight, I think.